Hello everyone, Loremaster of Sotek here, and it's time for more Vampire Counts goodness. This is going to be our third episode in this little series focusing on a proposal for a Vampiric Bloodlines DLC video for, or idea for Total War Warhammer 3. We've talked about the Strigoi and the Necrocs already, and now we're going to be diving into the Lahmians. So the Lahmians they're kind of the most unique, really, I think, of the 5 bloodlines as far as how they tend to act and portray themselves, where the other 4 bloodlines tend to really be very heavy into warfare and being very horrific and powerful and very obvious in a lot of ways, very grotesque or bombastic. The Lahmians tend to be far more subtle. They tend to prefer to be more sneaky, seductive, elusive. They're much more about avoiding being seen and manipulating the various forces of the Warhammer world, particularly the old world, from within. They're you can almost think of them as like the Tzeentchians of the vampiric bloodlines, except for they have seduction as a major part of that. They are also the only bloodline that is predominantly one gender, being that the other 4 bloodlines are just kind of a mix of whatever happens to be the situation. Though, you could argue that like the blood dragons are probably male dominated, because especially they tend to turn Bretonnians and knights, and in many of the nations of the old world, women are not allowed to become knights. The Lahmians, though, are almost entirely female. There are very, very, very few male Lahmians. And the few that have been around, things tend to get a little screwy from time to time. But in any event, when dealing with the Lahmians, we'll start as we have with every video, which is right at the top with the Legendary Lords. So the Legendary Lord for the Lahmians is by far the easiest of the 4 bloodlines that I'm going to be covering for this DLC proposal, and it has to be Neferata. Neferata is the only option. There is no debate. There is no considerations given to anyone else. Screw the rest of them. They don't matter. They're not important enough. Neferata has to be the choice. She's too important. She's too consistently active. And whenever Lahmians are up to anything, Neferata is always elbow deep in whatever scheme or idea is going on. It has to be Neferata. So who is Neferata? For those unaware, Neferata is the very first of the vampires. She is the original. She is the vampire queen. So way, way, way back in the days of Neferata, Neferata was a princess of the city of Lahmia, and she had a lot of power within the city. But she ran into various issues because, despite the fact that she wielded a significant amount of authority, she wielded a significant amount of power, she kind of was constantly second best to various individuals. So, for instance, her husband, Neferata's power was, while she wielded much authority, she wasn't able to be as important as she wanted to be, and kind of had to constantly be secondary to her husband, who she despised. He wasn't a really great guy. Also, her father kind of completely abandoned her because her father participated in the wars against Nagash, which Neferata herself did not get to participate in. She was too young for that, but she was alive during the end of it. And her father played such a key role that when the war was over, he actually ascended to take the throne of Khemri, and he moved to the city of Khemri and left his daughter behind. So she was left behind in Lahmia to just kind of sit there twiddling her thumbs. The other thing that she got very irritable about is that Neferata desired knowledge. She desired power. And one of the things that constantly really angered her was the priesthoods, like the mortuary cult especially. Neferata wanted to do things like learn magic, but magic was not supposed to be learned by women. The mortuary cult and many of those different castes among the priesthood were very, it was male dominated and male specific. They excluded women from learning magic. It was considered a man's sphere of knowledge, and she deeply resented that. And while Neferata's husband eventually got bumped off, and she was able to gain a significantly more authority within Lahmia, she still had various issues. But into this situation comes Wazoran and the other soon-to-be vampires. So this city is where Wazoran's from, because he was like the chief advisor to Neferata, and he was also actually an acolyte of Nagash, because Nagash had built up kind of his own version of the mortuary cult, and Nagash kind of did a whole ploy where he purposefully exiled a bunch of his priesthood, claiming that like they had betrayed him and they were part of like the other mortuary cult, so they were all traitors to Nagash specifically, and he banished them in this big display of anger, when in reality they were loyal agents to him, and he sent them out so that they would be accepted into the other cities, so that they could manipulate the situation within those spheres of power. Their own sphere of influence would grow. And that was the case with Wazoran, is that he learned a significant amount of necromancy and magic from Nagash himself. He was banished and ended up in Lahmia, and he covertly took over the mortuary cult from within and started turning it towards his own designs, and you could say Nagash's designs. But Wazoran ended up kind of influencing Neferata, and he noticed Neferata's inclinations. He noticed her resentments. And so Wazoran kind of started to manipulate her a bit, and planted the idea in her head of, well, you shouldn't let these people hold you back. You know, you should learn these things. Just because you're a woman doesn't mean you can't use magic. You know, they're just trying to hold you back. You could be so much more. We just need the right tools. We just need the right knowledge. And with Neferata kind of allowing herself to be influenced, because this very much spoke to her personal grievances and beliefs, she ended up, through using agents, was able to steal various artifacts and some of the books of Nagash from Nagash's Black Pyramid and bring them back to Lahmia, where Neferata, with Wazoran's help, and according to some novels, though the canonicity of it is very debatable, Archon the Black, she created her own version of the Elixir of Immortality. However, that version was flawed because they did not have all 9 of the books of Nagash, and also they were not Nagash. They did not have his brilliance. They did not understand all of the various minutiae of his arts when it came to dark magic and alchemy and all of these other various subjects. So while they did successfully create an elixir of eternal life, their version was flawed with the curse of vampirism. Neferata was the first to imbibe it, and she became the first vampire. And realizing how she had grown immensely in power, and realizing the scope of her new abilities and powers, despite the fact that she was functionally dead, she ended up spreading the curse of vampirism by allowing 5 other members of her court to drink from this same elixir. Those being Wazoran, her trusted advisor, who had been a very useful right-hand man to her all this time, Matmases, Herakte, as well, who a court vizier and the chief judge of Lahmia, to really make sure they were on her side and were part of her court. And then she also she let 4 other people drink at this time, and then Abarash. But Neferata tricked Abarash. He did not drink from it willingly. He was the captain of Neferata's guard, and he was also madly in love with her. But Neferata had a very, shall we say, courtly view on love, a very chivalric view on love, where although Neferata also loved Abarash, to them it was kind of like the proper way to do it was not to consummate that love. It was for it to be kind of this ever desired but never attainable thing, where Abarash always desired to be with Neferata, and he always loved Neferata, but Neferata was his queen. Neferata was his superior, and it was not proper for the two of them to consummate that relationship. So, and it's literally will they, won't they for thousands of years, and they never do, for anyone curious. But despite kind of that interplay, Neferata deeply desired for Abaresh to become one of the vampires. She wanted him to ascend to this level with her, to embrace it, but he wouldn't. It went against his codes of honor, especially the whole feeding on the blood of the living thing. So she actually tricks him into drinking it, and Abaresh is enraged by this. He actually refuses to drink anybody's blood for days until it deteriorates him to such an extent that he breaks down and ends up losing himself to like an animalistic fury where he brutally massacres a whole bunch of people, like gorging himself on their blood until he comes to and like realizes what he's done, which is why he actually tries so hard to he says, okay, if I'm going to be one of these things, we have to have a set of rules. Like, we have to have a set of rules that we all agree to follow. And he basically initiates a set of laws. Now, most of the vampires, including Neferata, kind of ignored this. They ignored many of the little tidbits of these rules, but they did agree to some of them. For instance, they agreed to never attack one another. That, like, no matter what, they would stay allies, and even if they had disputes, they would not attempt to kill one another, which would end up biting Neferata in the ass when her younger brother Ushorin, the Master of Masks, would sneak in one day to her chambers, and he actually stole he snuck enough of the elixir to become a vampire, which pissed off Neferata immensely because she hated Ushorin. She despised her younger brother. She thought he was an idiot. She thought he was just absolutely inept. And everything about him like deeply irritated her, just his existence. The last person, of course, to drink was Vashanesh. When Vashanesh arrived from the city of Khemri, he had learned about what was going on with the rumors in Lahmia. He had been hearing whispers about how the court in Lahmia was somehow corrupt, and there was something sinister going on there because the vampires weren't being careful. They were being too overt, too obvious, and many of their more macabre desires were starting to leak out as rumors and myths into the rest of Nehekhara. So Vashanesh actually arrived, and being a direct descendant of Nagash, he also had quite a bit of kind of like royalty and authority, and he was very impressive to everyone. He actually ended up kind of being a big deal because he was not intimidated by Ushorin when Ushorin like threatened to crush him because he traded some pretty sharp words with him. He was not intimidated or bothered by any of the vampires, and he was so charismatic, so regal, that Neferata almost instantly kind of fell for him. And Neferata ended up actually sending Abaresh away, and Wazoran. Like, Wazoran was almost always kind of this little leech or parasite that was constantly by her side, whispering in her ear and trying to manipulate her. And when Vashanesh arrived, she told Wazoran to kind of piss off because she wanted to have a private audience with Vashanesh. And she even sent Abaresh away, not believing, being like, well, he can't hurt me anyway because I'm a vampire and he's just a man. But also, like, there's kind of a snub in there where Abaresh, has all these unrequited feelings for her. And that was a whole dramatic thing. And she's so impressed with Vashanesh, especially among their personal conversation, that she basically offers a political but also not so political marriage. And the two of them are wed, and Vashanesh is given the last of that elixir and becomes the last of the original vampires. So Neferata rules over Lahmia with Vashanesh by her side. Things go well for, I think, a couple hundred years, maybe. I want to say it's more than a few decades. It might just be decades, actually. But things go well for a while until eventually the whole Khalida, there's the whole Khalida incident where Khalida from the city of Liberis, who is Neferata's cousin, and they have an interesting relationship. It's vaguely implied to be a little more than just familial, but Khalida learns that something is going on in Lahmia, and so she goes there herself, and upon doing her own forms of investigations and checking, she realizes that there are some deeply sinister things happening in Lahmia, and Khalida grows disgusted enough with Lahmia that she kind of becomes an antagonist to them and ends up challenging Neferata to a duel. And the two of them have this big battle. It's a one-on-one ceremonial duel, but they have it in the city of Lahmia, and it is during that duel that Neferata's full might is revealed. Khalida is enough of a skilled warrior, enough of a master duelist that she's able to force Neferata to rely on her abilities from being a vampire, her inhuman abilities and strengths, and Neferata ends up completely overwhelming Khalida and dealing her a mortal blow. But for Neferata, this isn't a complete, loss, because she loves Khalida very deeply, because she simply says, now that you understand the level of power that I have, now that you understand what I am going to give you my gift. I'm going to make you immortal. I'm going to make you like me. And she gives the blood kiss to Khalida against Khalida's will, because Khalida sees vampires simply as monsters. Inhuman, blasphemous, brutal creatures that are complete abominations. And so Khalida, in kind of her dying moments, as a priestess and very notable worshiper of the goddess Asath, calls out to the Nehekaran goddess Asath, the goddess of vengeance and beauty, and who is the goddess of the asp. So she's, like a serpent, and she begs her goddess to save her from this fate. And so Asath converts all of Khalida's blood into venom, which instantly kills her. And completely ruins the blood kiss. And Neferata is enraged by this. And Neferata, from that moment on, hates the Nehekaran pantheon, despises them because of what they took from her. So she goes on being a general thorn in everybody's side, but what she doesn't realize is there's a problem, because within her court, Wazoran, very much Wazoran was not alone in this, but Wazoran had been secretly kind of trading messages and making contact with Nagash, who had restored himself to unlife and had become kind of the terrifying undead abomination, the first true lich that we all know and love, and was building up in Nagashazar, and Wazoran had made contact with him. So Nagash and Wazoran were trading information, and Nagash's influence on Lahmia was discovered by the rest of Nehekara. It was found out that not only was Nagash essentially alive, but that he had agents and acolytes within the city of Lahmia itself, and that Lahmia was corrupted. So this big war breaks out where the entirety of Nehekara goes to war with Lahmia. Lahmia is put to siege, and although the vampires put up a hell of a fight, the Nehekarans are ultimately too powerful, and the city is destroyed. And Neferata and her entire court are forced to flee. So they end up fleeing. They all eventually gather in the north because they feel something calling to them. And lo and behold, it's Nagash. So the vampires, all 7 of them, the original 7, all gather to the great necromancer, and he welcomes them as his children. He welcomes them as these marvelous creations of his majesty and his genius. Even though, they kind of created themselves, they did it by using Nagash's tools, Nagash's wisdom. So he welcomes them as his new children and his greatest generals, because they are significantly more powerful than anything he's created through undeath. The fact that they were living humans that willingly did this to themselves and distilled an elixir that made them into these extremely powerful entities. Nagash was delighted for 2 main reasons, which was that A, they were so incredibly powerful and mighty in all these lovely ways, but that B, because they were creations of utilizing necromancy and his power, he had control over them. And they began to realize that Nagash was not simply kind of their original progenitor in a sense. He could literally control them. So the vampires present themselves to Nagash, and they're kind of trying not to see this as a bad situation, but Neferata in particular gets snubbed because she was the first. She is the first of the vampires. In some ways, she is the most powerful of the vampires. She's certainly the fastest. And her powers are expressed in a lot of really interesting ways. But when she presents herself as the first vampire and the queen of the vampires, Nagash acknowledges her but he passes over her and chooses her husband, Vashanesh, also later known as Vlad von Karstein, as his general. He deliberately picks Vashanesh over Neferata for a number of reasons. In some ways, Nagash, having been raised in the mortuary cult himself, did not respect women very much, did not care for them. He saw them as lesser. He also does not care for the charms of the fairer sex, one might say. Nagash seems to have never really had much of an interest in many of the joys of life, and seems to have always been very single-mindedly focused on his goals of eternal life and becoming a god, essentially. But on top of that, he knew Neferata wanted it. He knew so well, and he kind of saw a purpose in deliberately angering her and passing over Vashanesh. But there was also a little bit of nepotism, because he knows Vashanesh was one of his descendants, which definitely warmed him a little to Vashanesh. He definitely saw that as a plus. But in any event, Neferata, I think at that point it's like the third or fourth time in her life, gets massively screwed over, or kind of, you could say, backstabbed by a man in her life. And this happens to her a lot. Her first husband betrayed her. Wazoran betrays her. Nagash betrays her in that sense. Vashanesh eventually betrays her by pretending. Well, no, he's actually killed by the Nehekaran king Alcadizar, but he doesn't go back to Neferata after he resurrects. He just runs off into the wilds. And he never goes back to Neferata. He leaves her and goes on to explore his own ideas and interests, and then ends up taking another wife later in life, marrying Isabella, who he seems to genuinely love much more than he loved Neferata, which certainly bit. Even Abarash ends up functionally betraying Neferata, because he kind of gets tired of the whole chivalric love relationship that they have, and kind of sees, I think he kind of starts to see it for the manipulation that it is. But in any event, Neferata hates men. She's not a fan. She despises men. And granted, she has reasonable reason to. She has a lot of bad experiences, but she is like a hardcore misandrist. In any event, Neferata eventually escapes from Nagash after the death of Vashanesh, because when he dies, it frees all the vampires from Nagash's control long enough that they're able to flee from him, which of course leads to him cursing them with the curse of sunlight. But she wanders into the wilds, and she manages to survive until the kingdom of Strigos is established. She eventually shows up in Strigos and learns that her little brother Ushoran, who she already hates, has established a new empire that's meant to be a bigger, better version of Lamia. She does not take that well, because she sees that, instead of seeing that as a oh, I'm inspired by what Lamia was, but we can be better, we can learn from our mistakes and move on, she instead takes it as a jab. She takes it as Ushoran saying, hey, you remember that city that you ruled? The city that you made? Well, your version sucked, and my version is going to be so much better. I'm going to show you how much of an embarrassment you are. And so Neferata quite literally becomes possessed with this obsession of destroying Strigos, and she eventually succeeds. She manipulates all of the other vampiric bloodlines into thinking that the Strigoi consider themselves better than everyone else and are a threat to everyone else. She also ends up manipulating the Greenskins, all the Savage Orc tribes, to unleash this massive invasion that comes from the east and ends up watching over Strigos and absolutely wiping out the empire and leading to Ushoran's death. So she's pretty terrifying when it comes to manipulation. Ever since then, during that kind of whole escapade, she took over the dwarf hold of the Silver Pinnacle. She takes it for herself. She and a actually rather small group of allies, including the necromancer, oh gosh, I can't remember his, Morg something, but the necromancer that taught her how to use more advanced forms of magic. They successfully kill all the dwarfs and take the hold from them. and she claims it as her home. And that is where Neferata has been ever since, in the Silver Pinnacle that she has designed to be her master fortress. And there are rumors about the Queen of the Silver Pinnacle, said to be an unearthly beauty, the likes of which is unmatched by anything else in the old world. And there are legends that some legends say she's a monster, some legends said she's kept captive by monsters. So there are constantly adventurers trying to find their ways there, and eventually they might discover the Silver Pinnacle, and most of them die in the labyrinths that are beneath it, leading up to the actual place where Neferata and the other vampires live. But some make it to the top, where Neferata almost always always lures them in and either immediately kills them and feeds on them because she kind of enjoys that cat and mouse type game. Or sometimes, if they're particularly interesting, she will simply bleed them like cattle. Like, she'll take them as a pet, and she keeps them as a thrall. So, she's awesome, but also kind of sad and terrifying in a lot of ways. So that's Neferata. First vampire, hates men of all kinds. She also is a master schemer, master manipulator. There are Lahmian vampires in literally every single court in the old world. They've even found ways to infiltrate the dwarfs and even the elves. Not necessarily by having vampires in their courts, but by the Lahmians that are in charge of those particular networks of information, knowing how and who to manipulate in order to get information of what's happening within those courts. So she is an incredibly dangerous individual. She's constantly pulling strings, but she's not necessarily pure evil. She is often working against the forces of chaos. She also is one of the number one kind of premier enemies of Nagash. Anytime Nagash has tried to return to unlife, Neferata has always been one of the biggest champions attempting to thwart those efforts. So doing anything she can to offer information or aid to those that would be capable of stopping Nagash's resurrections. And she, of course, is always trading various barbs and other shenanigans with Khalida down in Liberis, because Neferata wants more than anything to reclaim Lamia. She would give anything to take Lamia back and restore it to its former glory, but she can't because the Tomb Kings are constantly on the watch for her, and the Tomb Kings hate her. The only person the Tomb Kings hate more than Neferata is Nagash. And for some of the Tomb Kings, like Khalida, they hate Neferata way more than they hate Nagash, because it's personal. And Khalida is not the only Tomb King that feels that, or Tomb Queen, but Tomb character that feels that way. There are a number of Tomb Kings who were tricked or manipulated or killed by Neferata and her spawn, and they hold that particular grudge very strongly against her. So that's Neferata. She would be a very big super badass. As far as what she would offer to the game, I think she should probably have she should be very fast, have one of the highest speeds. Granted, the vampires of Total War are not properly done. They're supposed to be significantly faster on foot than they are, but that's something we're going to talk about in kind of the 5th episode, which is more of a generalist episode as far as updates that kind of need to be made to the faction overall. But Neferata should be very quick. She should have very, very high melee defense and probably melee attack. Not necessarily as high when it comes to weapon damage and stuff like that. Fairly low armor, but she should have very high either a ward save or physical resistance to represent that she's very good at dodging. Neferata is said to be freakishly fast. Neferata is one of the fastest characters in the entirety of the Warhammer Fantasy setting. Even skilled elves struggle to keep up with Neferata because she is that goddamn quick. But on top of that, she is, of course, a wizard. Neferata, she is not the strongest wizard by any means. She struggles a little bit compared to some of the other characters within the vampire counts. There's a lot of very powerful vampires within the Warhammer Fantasy universe when it comes to magic. Neferata is not one of them. She's an she's an acceptably powerful wizard. She's by no means weak. She's like way better at magic than like Aberash was, for instance. But she's worse at magic than Vlad or Bazoran, and she might be kind of on par with Ushoran, maybe a little better than Ushoran. But in any event, as far as her magic goes, to kind of keep her interesting, I would probably give her a mixed lore. So she was able to take the lores of Shadow, Death, and Vampires. I think for her in particular, I would probably go like Lore of Shadows and Lore of Vampires as the mix, because Lore of Shadows is very Lahmian, right? It like screams Lahmian. They are like that with the lore of vampires. When it comes to her magic items, she has Akhmet Kar, the Dagger of Jet. It's a very, very nasty weapon back in the tabletop days. As far as how it would work in Total War, basically the idea behind the Dagger of Jet is that it like literally sucks the life force out of you. So it stabs you, and if you get cut by it, it sucks out like a chunk of your essence that leaves you permanently weakened for the rest of your life. So the way I would see it is, I think it'd be a really cool active ability where she's able to target an enemy character with it, and maybe it does a little bit of damage, but for like maybe the rest of that battle, it lowers their weapon strength, their melee attack, and their melee defense for the remainder of the battle. So maybe like -5 melee attack, melee defense, and minus like 5 or 10% weapon strength as just like a permanent debuff. But she can only use it once per battle. So she can either target like a lord with it or a hero or something like that. That might be a little too strong. It might be better as just like a passive aura, where maybe it could be like a debuff that she has as on her melee attacks, where if she hits you with a melee attack, she greatly reduces your melee attack and melee defense for like, you know, a limited time, kind of like a unique form of poison. So that could be how the Dagger of Jet works. She also has Akinseth, which is the Staff of Pain. And basically, Staff of Pain is that it just shoots a really powerful magic missile whenever she casts certain kinds of spells. I'm not sure exactly how they could implement it. I would love to see it represented like accurately, which would be that anytime Neferata casts a spell, she also shoots a magic missile at that target. So like imagine like a Shim's Burning Gaze, but like it's more, you know, it's made to look all shadowy and stuff to more match her aesthetic. And she shoots out this little bunch of missiles that slam into whoever she targets. So every single time she casts a spell, she also shoots out a bonus magic missile at the same target. I think that could actually be a lot of fun. If she's targeting an enemy unit. If she's targeting an enemy unit. Obviously, if you use like Invocation of Nehek, you don't want to shoot your own guys. It would be whenever she casts like a magic missile, a direct damage spell, or a hex spell. But I think that would actually be a lot of fun. I think that would be super cool. She should be an absolute badass in combat. She should be able to absolutely tear most people apart in close combat. Like I said, she should be rather lacking in the armor category. I also don't think she should have anti-large. I could see her having anti-infantry, like specializing against infantry units and characters and stuff like that. As far as the rest of her special rules go, she does have a really classic rule that would be super badass to see. It's had different titles throughout the various editions, but basically she has like the Curse of Vampirism or the Blood Kiss, because Neferata is so powerful and so ancient and is so experienced at giving the Blood Kiss that she has discovered like an expedited version where she can turn someone into a vampire in like a matter of seconds. So I think the way this could work would be super badass, would be Neferata should get an active ability where if she targets an enemy character with it and they're, say, below 10% health, she instantly kills them and in their place summons a vampire character. So like she insta-kills them, and in their place you get a vampire hero summon who has like, you know, the basic vampire hero stats and the basic vampire hero spells, who you just control until their summon wears out and they die. That would be insanely powerful, and I think would just be absolutely excellent. I think that would be a very, very badass way to interpret that rule, because that's quite literally what it did back in the tabletop days, and I think could be super duper duper strong. She has another ability called passive called Twilight's Allure, And the way that works is she literally would just have an aura that reduces melee attack. Because she is so beautiful. She is unearthly beautiful, like practically a goddess. She is so perfect in appearance, where people are just mesmerized by her presence and struggle to like strike at her. So that should just, I think that should just be represented by a melee attack debuff within like 35 meters. I think would be fine. So anyway, that's Neferata. Super awesome character. As far as mounts go, because we are not in the end times, you know, we're not doing the end times in Total War Warhammer, at least as far as we've seen so far. I would not give her end times mount, the Dread Abyssals, because we don't have Dread Abyssals in Total War Warhammer. Instead, I would make it where she can either be on foot, she can ride a Nightmare, a Hellsteed, and then a Coven Throne. I'd probably leave it at that. I think the Coven Throne should probably be her super mount. Neferata has never, ever in her life ridden a zombie dragon. And to be honest, I can't see her riding a zombie dragon. It really does not fit her aesthetic. I don't think she'd ever want to be caught dead riding one of those. Yeah, she's undead. Anyway, so I don't think she should have a zombie dragon. I think the Coven Throne should be her ultimate mount, though her should be unique and like extra powerful. So you may be wondering, Sotek, what the hell is a Coven Throne? So that is our first new unit, the Coven Throne. Coven Thrones are an alternate version of the Mortis engine. So there are these large, like chariot-looking things that are carried aloft by spiritual units, and we'll have a picture up here. Coven Thrones are super badass. They can be taken as a mount by vampire lords and regular vampires, so they can be taken by your lords and heroes. And basically, they are massive buff pieces for your vampires that also provide significant debuffs to enemy units. The primary thing they would do is that they would provide a pretty heavy amount of additional defenses to your vampire, so they'd give you a massive bonus to your health. They'd give you a noticeable bonus that your armor would, like, compared to infantry, your armor would go down, but as far as mounts are concerned, they'd actually have, like, I think a pretty high armor. They're large, allow you to push through enemy units, very high mass, able to run over like infantry and knock down monstrous infantry and stuff like that. And they also have a pretty serious ward save. Like, I would honestly expect them to have like a flat 15% ward save, maybe even a 20% ward save, or at the very least physical resistance. But honestly, I think it should be just a flat ward save to make them like really extra tanky and resistant to all forms of like missile fire and harassment and stuff like that. As far as unique abilities go, they are pretty terrifying combatants, because not only do you have this big giant chariot thing that's pulled by a host of spirits that's like constantly attacking people, but on the Coven Throne, besides the vampire themselves, are two vampire handmaidens. They're called Pallid Handmaidens, and they are two very lovely vampire ladies whose goal is to support the vampire in charge. So they are constantly attacking people, like ripping open people's throats and attacking people that are nearby. So I actually think, as far as like a chariot type model goes, it should have much higher melee attack and armor piercing weapon strength than you would expect. It should be very good at like dealing heavy amounts of damage to nearby enemies. Outside of that, it should get the bonuses from having being pulled by spectral units. So I would say it should have Strider, so it's able to move over all forms of terrain without penalty. And then it has two special rules on top of all of that stuff. The first is called the Scrying Pool. So in the center of the Coven Throne is a cauldron of blood, filled with blood, that the Coven Throne, the vampires on it, use their magic to see the future. It allows them to see what's going to happen and allows them to react accordingly. So even as people are attacking them, they already know who's going to attack them and how they're going to be attacked, so they're able to take action to like avoid or dodge it. So basically what it does is it should be a buff that you activate, that when you activate it, it should increase the melee attack and the melee defense of the Coven Throne. Like, it should be like a big buff. Like, it should have a long cooldown, but like should be able to be used an infinite number of times, long, like maybe like a 2-minute cooldown, But it, like, I'm talking like plus 40 melee attack, plus 40 melee defense, like really big dick buff to your combat capabilities. So it really is like a nice clutch for when you're fighting elite enemy units or a character or something. The other ability is called Battle of Wills. So the way Battle of Wills work is that, of course, there are 2 or sometimes 3 very lovely, sexy vampires riding on this throne of blood and macabre design. And all 3 of them are usually blessed with some form of hypnotic gaze that they are unleashing on people. And they are able to manipulate the wills of those who are approaching the Coven Throne to either make it where they will struggle to attack the Coven Throne, or even they'll become so entranced, so enchanted by the vampires that they will instead attack their allies. The best way to represent this, it's a little bit of a tricky thing to represent. The way I would probably do it is it could either be a buff that grows with time, or it could be just like a passive that has a much more simple effect. So like if you want it to be a more simple passive, maybe it could be like it's a debuff to the leadership and maybe some other combat stats of nearby units as their wills are kind of being drained by the vampire. So it's like -8 leadership and minus, I don't know, weapon strength or minus melee defense or melee attack, whatever. A more interesting way to do it could be that it could be like an active ability that you pick on an enemy unit, and when you do so, like it may be like Gorda's Backstabber could have like a random effect where if the unit is fortunate, they just get a small debuff, and if the unit is very unfortunate, then they like attack nearby allies. I don't know if that's actually a system in Total War Warhammer now I think about it. You know what it could be? You know what it could be is what if it's a passive around the Coven Throne, or maybe it's a passive that only activates if the Coven Throne is in close combat, and it's an AoE passive that lowers the leadership of enemy units and also makes them subject to what do you call it? Not frenzy, rampage. So like if you throw it into enemy units, it lowers their leadership, and it also makes it where, you know, the other player could lose control of them as they're just kind of like driven into attacking whatever's around them without really thinking accurately, and they're not listening to orders. That would actually be very, very powerful. That's, you know, rampage is a nasty mechanic, so I think that could actually work really well. Now, traditionally, the Coven Throne can only be taken as a mount, so in tabletop, you could only take it as an upgrade to put your Vampire Lord or your Vampire Hero on. However, Total War has a very regular habit of taking mounts and making them into standalone units, and I think the Coven Throne would be perfect for that. Just because it's such a big, badass, awesome piece, I would love to see it possible as taking as a separate unit. So yeah, give me the Coven Throne as a regular unit and as a mount for Neferata, the Lahmian Vampire, and the regular Vampire Lord and Vampire Hero. I think that'd be super sick. So that's the Coven Throne. The next unit that I would propose is called the Unholy Blades. So Unholy Blades, I think, could be a really sexy unit to look at, and actually would be a really fun challenge for the unit design department. So what Unholy Blades are is they are possessed weapons or possessed suits of armor. So imagine a unit that is literally just empty suits of armor with swords or axes or whatever, like various weapons. And so you have this unit of empty armor suits that are purely animated by magic. So maybe you can like see little tendrils of dark magic connecting all the different parts of the armor and like the weapon to it. And the entity, it has like these wild attacks where it swings and like, parts of the armor like are falling down and constantly reconstructing themselves into the vague shape of a human. It could have some really fascinating animations because it's not held back by there being like actual people inside of it. But these are the spirits of warriors or other various individuals who have been trapped because they died either like caught in like a deep rage or deep despair. There was something about their death where they weren't able to let go. They were so emotionally charged that they couldn't move on to the afterlife, and elements of their spirit possessed the weapons and armor that they wore in life, and has caused them to become these functionally undead entities that are made purely out of suits of armor and weapons. I think it would make for an awesome like mid to elite infantry. It should have very, very high armor, but very low health. So because they're purely made out of metal, they don't have any like fleshy bits at all to shoot, no bones to crack. They're purely made of armor and magic. I would have them have very high armor and very high physical resistance. Probably high missile resistance as well. I would basically make it where if you're not attacking them with magic, they shrug off a significant amount of damage. As far as what weapons they wield, you could give them literally anything. If you wanted to give the vampires kind of a much needed niche, maybe they could be halberd infantry. Maybe they could have like various assortments of halberds or pikes or, various weapons that give them an anti-large bonus despite being infantry. That's armor piercing, something that's been very highly requested. A lot of people are like, oh, I want halberd graveguard. Well, you could do unholy blades for that. Alternatively, they could, just be very effective at like cutting through infantry. You could have them just have like an anti-infantry bonus. But I think they could be a really, really badass looking unit. I acknowledge that I'm kind of in the barrel scraping aspect of things. And this is something I've kind of been talking about on stream, is that for the Lahmians and Blood Dragons, I'm going to tell you guys now, I am really scraping the bottom of some barrels for unit ideas. But anyway, so that's I think the second option. Granted, I could see the argument that could be a Blood Dragon unit instead of a Lahmian unit, because it's like, oh, I mean, they're warriors that possess their equipment after death. Doesn't that sound kind of more Blood Dragon than Lahmian? But it doesn't really matter where each unit goes. I'm just giving you 3 units per video. The last one would be a vampire infantry unit. Another thing that's been very heavily requested. Kind of like how the Vampire Coast have the oh my gosh, I can't remember what they're called, but how they have the elite vampire infantry, giving elite vampire infantry to the vampire counts. But I think they should be Lahmian, not Blood Dragons. I think when most people think elite vampire infantry, they think, oh, I'll just take a Blood Knight and put them on foot. But I think that's a little too lazy. And also, it doesn't really fit the Blood Knight aesthetic. Blood Knights are very similar to Bretonnians, and they're also very similar to like Empire Knights, where riding on a steed, having some kind of mount, is a core aspect of their identity. The vast majority of Blood Dragons are all epic mounted warriors. They're either riding nightmares, or they're riding hell steeds, or they're riding dragons. There are no famous Blood Dragons that are known for being super cool infantry guys. They're always obsessed with replicating chivalry, replicating knighthood, and a core aspect of that is being mounted warriors, and having all of kind of that glorious imagery that comes with knighthood. And don't get me wrong, I will be talking about some really cool Blood Dragon ideas in the next video tomorrow. But for the Lahmians, I think the Lahmians should take over the infantry slot, because they would have such a different aesthetic. And what I'm thinking for Lahmians would be essentially the Pallid Handmaidens, but as an infantry block. So there should be very, very few of them. Like, I'm thinking like 16, maybe 20, like not a lot of them, but they should be very lightly armored. I want them to be full Lahmian aesthetic. I don't want them to be like sexy vampire ladies barely wearing clothes, or I don't want them wearing von Karstein clothes. I want them fully embracing Neferata's type of imagery, where they have these, this kind of interesting mixture of like old world and Nehekaran imagery fused together. So they have all these very Lahmian aesthetic like helms and pieces of armor, but it's fairly light armor. It's more like flowing armor that you would expect to see more like in a desert, or armor that encapsulates the beauty of Lahmia. But it allows them to rely on their speed, because that's what makes Lahmians different, is that they're fucking fast. They're insanely fast. They are the fastest vampires, bar none. So I would love the idea that they're less about like monstrously high weapon strength, and more about very, very high, like very high physical resistance to represent them dodging around despite the fact they have low armor. And then they have, maybe you could have high missile resistance as well to represent them able to literally be dodging arrows, dodging bolts. Once again, really only vulnerable to magical weapons or magical spells, which would make spell resistance much more valuable as like a nearby buff from certain kinds of units. And then, they have Vampiric, so as long as they're fighting in combat, they're regenerating. I think they should have some form of hypnotic gaze. So either they have the hypnotic gaze active, or they just have a passive that debuffs people when they're in combat. Maybe they have like a unique debuff on their melee attacks that's called like Enthrall or something that just nerfs people that are fighting them. But they should have very high movement speed, very high melee attack, very high melee defense. While their weapon strength maybe should not be super high, I do think it should be mostly armor piercing because they are vampires, and vampires hit like fucking trucks. There's no such thing as a vampire that cannot tear through plate armor like it's paper. Vampires are very, very scary strong. But I think that would make for a really awesome interpretation of that unit and would help them feel very refreshing, very unique and distinct. I don't really have a great name for them off the top of my head because like Vampire Handmaidens doesn't necessarily sound that epic. But I don't know. That's kind of my idea. Let me know what y'all think about that down below. And don't worry. I've got some really cool stuff to talk about with the Blood Dragons. I even found like a really nasty kind of monster for them. Trust me. But so those are the units. I will say I would very much like to see the Lahmian Vampire Lord definitely redesigned a fresh bit. I feel like all of the unique Vampire Lords should be redesigned with new assets. I would very much like to see the Lahmian Vampire Lord look much more like Neferata and much less like Avant Karstein. Though, because they're Lahmians, I actually wouldn't mind if they created like a couple different versions. Like they all wield the same weapons, but maybe one looks more like the one we have now. One looks more like Neferata. One looks more like from like a different culture, like because they're very big on being spies and kind of blending into the cultures they hang out with. So that could be fun. But if I had to pick one, I would prefer for them to match more Neferata's aesthetic. And they should, have the whole list of mounts. All the way up to a zombie dragon. I'm totally fine with them riding zombie dragons. I do think they should get a new hero, being like a Lahmian Thrall. I think the Lahmian Thrall, there are two ways you could go with it. I think the best way to go with it, because of how its agent actions would work, is I would have the Lahmian Thrall be like, a beautiful vampire woman who she has very unique agent actions that allow her to infiltrate societies. And that should be kind of like when we're talking about Lahmian campaign mechanics, they should be all about manipulation. So what I'm kind of thinking is take the high elf mechanic of being able to like earn influence and spend it to manipulate other cultures, and combine that with the Tzeentch mechanic of being able to like outright screw certain cultures. Like I don't think they should be able to steal settlements or halt factions or any of that kind of stuff. But I do think that they should be able to like start a war between two factions, like force a war between two factions, force peace. Imagine that, force peace between two factions, force maybe some kind of alliance between two factions, or force break certain alliances. But then on top of that, they also have the high elf mechanic of if they have a trade agreement with you, they can see you, or if they have they're able to manipulate how factions feel about one another and how they feel about you by spending a unique resource so that they're able to move the diplomacy up and down. That might be overkill to have both of those systems. Another thing is, actually, you know what? If I had to pick, now that I think about it, if I had to pick, I think I would prefer them to have the Zinch mechanic, but it's purely for diplomacy stuff. So they can't take settlements, they can't halt faction or anything like that, but they're just able to manipulate like how factions feel about one another. And then the other thing is they should have Slaaneish's mechanic. They should be able to force vassalize human factions, but only humans. It should be strictly related to humans, so it's not as powerful as the Slaanesh version, which is for elves, beastmen, and humans. For the vampires, it should be purely humans, because, you know, that's people they can actually bite and use the blood kiss on and turn them into thralls and stuff like that. So maybe just all three of those mechanics are kind of some kind of mix. So they're able to manipulate the diplomacy meter between factions. They're able to force certain kinds of diplomatic treaties or force war, or either force treaties and force the breakdown of treaties between factions, and also be able to forcefully turn human factions into thralls if they like build up enough manipulation over them. I think that would be super fucking badass and would really help them feel like these ultimate web pullers and schemers over the old world and the nations of men specifically, while also still able to influence other races. And I really think that would help give Slaanesh and Zinch like a big rival within the death factions that's able to do this level of manipulation. I think that would be super badass. As far as like objectives go, for a Neferata campaign, your goal should be to reclaim Lahmia, like take back Lahmia. You should have some super kind of sexy tier 5 Uber landmark building waiting for you in Lahmia. You should also have a goal to wipe out Khalida and defeat her faction. And then I would assume she would probably want to like wipe out the Tomb Kings and also like beat up a lot of the other vampires, and then vassalize like most of, like, I would probably say you need to vassalize Bretonia and you need to vassalize the Empire. Maybe for an ultimate or like long victory, you also need to vassalize or destroy Kislev and Grand Cathay on top of claim Lahmia, destroy Khalida's faction. That could be fun. As far as legendary heroes go, I did not talk, many of you noticed, I did not talk about a legendary hero during the Strigoi video. And the reason is, I'm going to be just kind of bluntly honest. Realistically, I think we would get 2 legendary heroes. One is part of the DLC and one is a free LC. Because that kind of seems to be the system now. And for me, I just don't really think it's debatable. I think the 2 characters that I would just have to go with would be Dieter Hellschnitt, the Necromancer, and Conrad von Karstein. And there you go. And you can get them with any of the Vampire Count factions. I think regardless of what bloodline you play, they would be willing to work with you. Conrad is insane, but it is very, very possible to manipulate him. And every single bloodline would benefit from having him in the pocket, especially because he can't use magic. So he's really not that much of a threat as far as like taking over your bloodline. He's kind of an insane blender. You just got to make sure you point him at the right targets. And Dieter Hellschnitt, a necromancer, is useful to everybody. Every single vampire bloodline needs necromancers. Morath, that's his name. Morath, the necromancer Morath was the one that taught Neferata most of what she knows about the lore of vampires and like her more advanced magics. It was Morath who would eventually go on to be killed by Sigmar. But in any event, I believe that's everything for the Lahmians. So do let me know what y'all think in the comments down below. I will be back tomorrow to discuss the Blood Dragons and to go over all their kind of units and legendary lords and stuff. But yeah, let me know what y'all think of everything down below. Do you hate my call out of legendary heroes? Do you think I should be considering some other characters? Do you agree with Neferata, or would you want somebody else? How do you feel about the units? Whether you think they fit the theme, or whether you're just like, no, that's stupid, or I don't know, I'd love to have that. Just let me know. I really appreciate it. And like I said, I will be reading through the comments because I'd like to address a lot of them in the fifth and kind of like final video for the Bloodlines DLC proposal. But I hope you're all having a marvelous day, and I will see you around. Thanks so much for watching. Take care.